Hi, everybody. As you're all kind of slowly pouring into this webinar, I'll just speak a little bit slowly as you're all kind of making your way in. So fantastic to see you all joining this very important webinar. I'm Kate Fairman, Upper House Greens MP, and I first of all would like to acknowledge, of course, that you and all of us are zooming in today from Aboriginal land, stolen land. I'm here in Redfern on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And of course, tonight even we will be talking about some of the appalling things that have happened to country, and coal and gas mining is, of course, one of the worst that has happened to country. And hopefully we'll be able to tonight talk about some actions that we can take going forward. Thank you all for joining. Feel free to put into the chat the Q&A, if you like, where you are zooming in from, which country you're from, and introduce yourself as we kind of get started on this webinar. So this webinar is all about the Hunter Valley, and it was titled From Riches to Ruin, What Coal Mining is Doing to the Hunter Valley. We know, I'm sure all of you know, in some ways where it's up to in terms of the scale of coal mining in the Hunter Valley, although I think everybody, when they go there, is just so surprised at the scale of it. But worse, it is expanding. And that is just absolutely unfathomable that we here in New South Wales in 2023 could be facing the situation where we are seeing more coal mines being approved and existing coal mines getting approval to expand. That's exactly what we're talking about tonight. We've got three amazing panelists who have given up their, Wednesday evening to talk all things coal in the Upper Hunter. So if they wanted to join us now, and as they're joining us, we've got and I'll introduce them all in a second. Remember, this is a webinar, so it's the way to engage is via the Q&A box. I'll be asking questions, your questions of the panelists at the end of their talk. So each one is going to give roughly about 10 minutes. And honestly, I have sat in rooms with all three of these wonderful speakers, and we could hear from them for hours. They are just so knowledgeable. So it's going to be very hard to contain what they have to talk about within 10 minutes, but always the questions are really fruitful. So I want to make sure we leave enough time for your questions. So what I am going to do is kick straight in. We are going to start with we've got Nick Clyde from Lock the Gate, who is, many of you, if you've been following the coal and gas situation in New South Wales, would have come across. Nick's a fantastic activist, coordinator, wonderful all-round human doing fantastic things for the planet. Bev Smiles, who I've known for quite a long time now, a rivers activist, coal activist, has just not stopped fighting for the environment for many decades. And Dr. Julia Imrie, who I have only more recently met on a recent trip to the Upper Hunter, where we talked about the impact of the expanding coal mining in right near her property. She's done a PhD on the impacts of coal mining on water. She's a water expert and has a lot to share and add in that regard as well. So wonderful panel. Let's get right into it now let's go straight to Nick, who is going to give us a wonderful kind of overview of what is happening in the state of New South Wales, particularly obviously with coal mining and where it's up to. And honestly, it is absolutely shocking the extent of what is planned. Over to you, Nick.
Hey, well, thank you very much for the invite tonight, Kate, and to the New South Wales Greens. Thank you for having me. Just getting my little prezzo ready to go. Can everyone see that? Yep, great. Okay. Hey, and I just want to acknowledge I'm joining you from Gadigal Wongal country here in Sydney, and I pay my respects to all of the Indigenous folks working so hard across the state of New South Wales to protect culture and country from unwanted coal and gas projects. Okay, so yes, as Kate said, so I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot here of my take on what's going on with coal in New South Wales. I'm trying to speak to the Hunter in particular, but I sort of felt it was important to give you the kind of whole picture, and hopefully that dovetails into what Bev and Julia and Kate, the conversation that we're going to have once we've gotten through this material. So here we go, without any more ado. So the context, I just want to tell you where we're at with climate, then talk about the projects that have been approved, the projects that are in the planning pipeline, all coal. And then I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the direct emissions, really surprisingly large amount of direct emissions that are added to the New South Wales greenhouse inventory, just mining and processing the coal before any of it is burnt. I want to tell you about how poorly regulated that is in New South Wales. We're failing to drive those emissions down at the moment. And just finishing on well, does any of this matter, and what should we do about it? So, here we go. We all know this. You wouldn't be on this webinar if you didn't know this already, but we've really got to do something about coal emissions if we have any chance at all of maintaining a safe climate on planet Earth. Why does that matter for New South Wales? Well, my colleague George Woods was involved in some research at the beginning of this year that was released in February. It didn't get wide pickup in Australia. It got a bit more news overseas, but it found that actually New South Wales is amongst the top 10% globally of jurisdictions expected to be most hard hit from the impacts of climate change. And you guys know that as well as I do from just what we've experienced in this state over the last 3 or 4 years. So there's a lot at stake there. I won't speak to that other than to say, obviously carbon emissions keep rising. Under the previous coalition government, 26 new fossil fuel projects approved in New South Wales in that reign, and those carbon emissions continue to rise. What will Labor do? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. This is the list of those 26 projects, with Mount Pleasant at the top there being the one that was most recently approved. Just a gigantic greenhouse problem if all of those projects are built and operate to the end of their life or extended. They have already been approved. Some of them are still the subject of legal challenge, including Mount Pleasant, both in New South Wales and in the federal court. As Kate mentioned, as if 26 new projects is not bad enough, there's at least 10 new projects in the planning pipeline. Half of those are either in the Hunter Valley or on the Central Coast. I've highlighted those in blue. And in terms of tonnage, the biggest projects tend to be clustered in the Hunter Valley, the biggest expansion projects. So that's a lot of coal. The ROM coal figure would be the amount of coal that they are seeking to approval to mine over the life of those projects. And some of them, like Hunter Valley Operations at the top, want to mine all the way out till mid-century. Another way of looking at those two graphs there, the 26 projects and the 10 proposed, is the blue columns there are the cumulative total of new coal approved in each of those calendar years. And then the red and the grey, the red column for 2023 is the cumulative total of coal seeking approval from 8 new projects. And grey are another 2 projects that aren't yet in the planning system. There's a Maules Creek expansion and a Rix's Creek expansion. So another 2, but combined, those 10 projects, you can see it represents actually a really gigantic expansion in absolute terms of the industry if those projects are approved. That said, there's there's a serious danger that pretty much all of those projects will be approved unless the new government changes the pro-coal policy settings of the former government. And we saw that most recently with Mount Pleasant, where the Planning Commission said, look, you know, these are the policies of the government. It's to continue not just expanding the coal industry, but even exploring for brand new coal deposits. So that's one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize. We desperately need the new government to change, to ditch that policy and update it. And I'll come to that again at the end. In terms of why all of this matters and the cumulative impact, this slide here represents Matt Keane's emissions inventory projections when he was the outgoing Minister for Energy. These are the New South Wales government's figures, and what they show is that you'll notice every sector in the state, with the single exception of fugitive emissions, 95% of which in New South Wales are coal mine methane emissions. That is the only sector that the New South Wales government is projecting will actually increase its emissions out to 2030, and by a fairly substantial margin there too. I've just got an eye on the time because there is a bit here to get through, but I'll try and be snappy. It's a surprisingly large problem.
Right, Nick.
The direct emissions from mining too, 18.6 million tonnes. Just to process and mine all of that coal consumes 3% of the state's electricity. You might have heard of the safeguard mechanism. Of those safeguard mechanism facilities in New South Wales, that includes all industry, you know, like the BlueScope Steelworks and the Tomago aluminium smelter, all of our big industrial emitters. Of the 40 facilities that report more than 100,000 tonnes of emissions, 28 of those are coal mines. Well, actually, it's changed. Yeah, 40, 38. It depends how you look at the data. What you'll notice too from the safeguard emissions conversation at the federal level is that the narrative is, look, Chris Bowen and the federal government have introduced this reform, and they hope that those facilities will each cut their emissions by almost 5% per annum to 2030. So I thought I'd just give you a quick snapshot of how realistic that is at the moment under current policy settings. Here is a table that I made yesterday based on clean energy regulated data. These are the top 10 greenhouse gas emitting coal mines in New South Wales, so scope 1 emissions. So that's methane and diesel fuel emissions. What you can see from this table is that 8 out of the 10 most polluting mines in New South Wales reported an increase in their emissions last year. Some, as you can see, a very substantial increase in emissions. I don't want to kind of go into, well, we don't have time to go into the detail of each one, but I did do a bit of a snapshot looking at their annual reviews. There's all kinds of reasons why these mines report increases. Typically, it's linked to, look, we just produced more coal, so our emissions went up, or we mined a part of our coal seam that has more methane in it, and so we released more methane into the atmosphere. Or there might be other peculiar issues to the mines, but generally, that is the score. It's quite rare to read an annual review that talks about their emissions reducing as a result of greenhouse gas reduction measures that the mine has implemented. And I should just say briefly, the law in New South Wales on paper requires all coal mines in the state, so that's about 40 that are operating at the moment. On paper, every single one of those mines is required by law to implement what they call all reasonable and feasible abatement measures. So that might be, you know, buying renewable energy, electrifying your mining fleet of vehicles, or implementing various measures to reduce the methane emissions of those coal mines. So by law, all of them are required to do that, but the devil is always in the detail. What we find from reviewing all of these annual reports, and I had a look at all all of the annual reports for all 10 mines is that there's just no evidence that all reasonable and feasible abatement is being implemented. Very little evidence at all. Here's the Mount Thorley Warkworth mine. That's an open cut mine in the Hunter Valley. Their emissions, their Scope 1 emissions, they increased by 5% last year. You go into their annual environmental review that's meant to report on the environmental performance of the mine, 224-page document. There's actually nothing, there is no greenhouse information in that document at all. And they are one of the top 10 emitters in the state of New South Wales. So then I had a look at Yancoal's sustainability report for last year, and they say, oh yeah, well, across our operations, actually, we had a 7% increase in our emissions. And they basically say, look, our emissions are pegged to our production. We produce more coal, we produce more emissions. That was Warkworth. So, and this is kind of typical as well. Bengalla, there's increased by 61%. That is a gigantic increase. Bear in mind, under the safeguard mechanism, they're meant to be cutting emissions year on year by about 5%. Well, last year, increased by 61%. You go in, you have a look at their annual review, and it's full of this language that just doesn't mean anything and is unenforceable. We have a high-level implementation roadmap, and it's got net present value positive components. If you don't know what that means, I think you're in good company. I got no idea what it means. And if you went to the Land and Environment Court and said, look, Judge, I don't think the Bengalla mine is implementing their net present value positive components effectively because their emissions have jumped by 61%. You should make them implement their net present value positive components. They're just going to look at you like you've lost your mind. It's meaningless. It's ridiculous. This is not a greenhouse gas plan to reduce emissions. I looked at Mount Pleasant. They want to double the size of their mine. They want to continue mining out to 2048. As I mentioned, that's being challenged by a local environment group in the Hunter that Bev and Julia know very well, and I'm sure Kate does too. It's also being challenged in the federal court by Environmental Justice Australia. Here's Ashton, again, massive increase, 45%. And the quote, if you can see at the bottom of the page there, what's fascinating about that is that their emissions increased by 45%, but you look at their annual review and they say, oh, well, as the controls and management measures in place during the reporting period were considered effective, that's what we'll keep on doing. We'll maintain status quo. So that doesn't give you much confidence, does it? Their 45% increase, and they think they're doing a great job. HVO, they want to expand that mine all the way out to 2050. This is the single largest coal expansion proposed in New South Wales since the Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016. Huge project, massive problems with their methane pollution there. They're applying to triple their already significant methane emissions by 2030, and they would continue rising all the way out to the late 2040s. In fact, in 2047, I think they're still projecting more than 1 million tonnes. And bearing in mind, that's just from mining the coal. That's 1 million tonnes of pollution without a single tonne being burnt. Chain Valley, I won't talk about that because I do want to finish and give the mic over to Bev and Julia. But I'll leave you with a couple of slides here. Narrabri Underground, in red is the existing emissions. The orange circle is around the 35% jump that they've just reported. And you can see from their projected emissions in future, they are certainly not projecting a decrease in emissions, quite the reverse, quite a dramatic increase in those emissions. And when they applied for approval of that mining project, Narrabri Underground Stage 3, basically they said, look, we can only abate less than 1% of our significant Scope 1 emissions. And when I added what they expect to abate to their own data and graphed it, I thought, okay, well, this is a Where's Wally exercise. The red represents what they say they can abate. It's so tiny that you can barely even see it graphed on the map there of their emissions. In terms of taking action, and I am finishing up now, Kate, Bev and Julia. So we've got a 5-minute explainer video. Would love to share that with you guys. I think it gives you a good overview of the problem. We've definitely got to dump these pro-coal policies that promote coal exploration, new coal expansions. We actually need the government to start producing an annual report that gets serious about looking at this problem and trying to assess, what's going on. Are mines actually doing anything to abate their emissions? Bearing in mind, there's at least 14 coal mines in New South Wales that don't even report their emissions to the state government. So how the government claims to know that they're reducing emissions is beyond me. The law already requires that abatement measures are implemented, but it's not enforced. It needs to be enforced. The monitoring and verification, complete mess. That needs a dramatic overhaul. And I mentioned the Bernie Hobbs video, one thing you could do is have a look at that. It's linked to a do-gooder action that Lock the Gate has. So at the end of that, you could send a note to Penny Sharp and Paul Scully, the Minister for Planning. So I hope that made sense. Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for running a little bit over time. Back to you, the Honourable Kate.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was amazing and frightening. And honestly, the scale of what you have just shown, I think most people on the in this webinar probably did not realise and do not realise the scope of it. I've got some questions around the methane emissions and what the companies, how they're kind of getting away with it. But I'll come back to that after we hear from Bev and Julia. And remember, everybody, throw your questions into the Q&A, probably, as opposed to the chat if you can. And what we will do, yes, Peter Sainsbury, we will get that link to you in the chat now. Usually after a webinar, I send an email to everybody that has RSVP'd via Eventbrite as well, and to my list with actions basically from tonight, which we'll do. So over to now, Julia, we're going to you first, aren't we? So we can do the maps and everything. Excellent. So I'll throw to you straight away, Julia.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so we're here. Yeah, thanks, Kate. Look, I'm speaking from Wiradjuri country, just north of Mudgee, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Look, that was a very impressive talk, Nick. I'm going to concentrate on the water impacts and use a bit of a case study for the Yulla area. And I've got a map there which sort of locates where we are on the within the Hunter. We're right at the very top, most western point of the Hunter Valley. The mines have been working here since the 1980s, or expanding. Prior to that, it was a very, very small underground mine with a little pit pony. So in the 80s, open cut mining really took off, and since then there's been it's a Yulin mine. Since then there's been the Moolarben mine and Wilpinjong mines have all moved into the area. But like, I suppose I'd sort of like to start with just emphasising the importance of water to people, to country, to the environment. It's something that we just cannot live without. And unfortunately, one of the big impacts with coal mining is on water systems, particularly on the groundwater systems. Part of my study did concentrate on groundwater and its importance, and its connectivity with surface water. It tends to get overlooked, and certainly has been in the past very much undervalued by governments and not regarded as being that important. However, we don't have, in the glaciers in Australia, we don't have big lakes, high rainfall. Groundwater is what sustains the flows in our creeks and rivers. It sustains our groundwater dependent ecosystems. It's something that we need to take very, very seriously. We need to respect it. We need to protect it. And
Julia, can I just jump in just with a quick pause?
Sure.
You will need to just let Ben, who's screen sharing, next slide. So
yes, go to the next. That sort of gives us the map.
If
too,
you could
so
just
a
include
location.
that, just remember.
Sorry, Ben. Yeah, just go to the one. There's only a few maps here. I haven't got any sort of much writing. So this map is showing the 3 coal mines that stretch across the upper reaches of the Hunter Valley. It's above Mudgee. You can see where Mudgee is there to the bottom of the screen, and Golgon to the west. Ulan Coal Mine's a big Glencore mine. Moolarben is a Yancoal mine, and Wilpinjong is a Peabody mine. And you can see these are the actual mining leases. They cover 302 square kilometres, and that's what the approvals so far they have. It has a cheek by jowl that all the mines link up, so it's basically one super mine, but it is mined by 3 different companies. And as you can see, it's actually bisects between the Goulburn River National Park, and the green bit at the bottom is the Bunghorn Gap Nature Reserve, a very important nature reserve, the first in New South Wales, in fact, the first one to be declared. So it also passes, Ulan Coal actually goes over into the Western Fall, the Western Fall, which is obviously in the Murray-Darling catchment. So it also has an impact to the western rivers as well. I suppose the geology is an important thing to talk about when you're talking about water in coal-bearing areas. It's a sedimentary sandstones, and these particular types of geology, the porous rocks and which are fractured and very much layered, hold and store a lot of water. Now, in the early days when Ulan first started up, they very much underestimated the amount of water that was in the landscape, because they put down drills and they said, oh, we can't pump much out of here. But it was all locked up in the pores and in the rocks, which of course is a fantastic way to feed the rivers, because it actually protects it in dry times and just slowly releases it as base flows into the creeks and rivers. So from an ecological point of view, it's a really, really important resource, the groundwater, which they just didn't care about or didn't realise, I suppose, in that stage. But now, you know, they're getting to the point where it's very, very obvious. Over the years, there's been every time, you know, they have increased, have to change their modelling to allow for the extra water that's coming into the system to be able to manage it. Because this water, unfortunately, gravitates when the landscape has been mined, and you get subsidence and cracking and so forth. It gravitates down to the void or the gulf, and that gets in the way of mining. Therefore, not only have you lost it from your landscape, but then the mines have to deal with it, and it can get contaminated with obviously the coal mining process as well. So it's the nature of the geology that is a huge storage potential for groundwater, which unfortunately the very act of the mining is they're dewatering this landscape. And you know, that's basically sterilising future land uses in this area. Now, I might just go to the next slide, because it actually shows the expansion, of exploration licenses that have been granted. Now, it's a little bit more complicated here, but the pink is still the mining leases existing, but all the blues are areas that they're exploring at the moment, or they've actually put in development applications to mine or extend their mines. Down the bottom there, below the Moolarben coal, there's a yellow circle. That's into the last bit of the Moolarben Valley there, which is a rather beautiful part. Boxwood land, it's got koalas. You know, there's lots of biodiversity ticks for this area, but they want to put another big 3 open cuts in there. Bev will talk more about the Wilpinjong extension, which is to the east, and Ulan was granted some enormous exploration licenses to the north and west, which they're in the process of drilling and exploring, which is they will presumably come up with some plan, but at this point it's still exploration. So this is another 210 square kilometres. And when you're talking about water, it's not just the footprint of the actual mined area either. The impacts spread out, and it can spread out from between 2 to 20 kilometres from the actual mining footprint. The drawdown on that groundwater system. So as you can see, the very scale of what's happening in this area, and has been happening now for over 30 years. But with every increase in the scale, they're having more and more impacts, and now they're actually crossed the range, and they're starting to affect the Talwar River. You can see to the northwest of the map there. And of course the Hunter, this is the upper reaches of the Hunter, and so this water will actually be missed all the way down from the Goulburn River, which feeds into the Hunter further down in Denman. So just to give you a bit of an idea, I suppose, of the amount of water that's coming from this landscape, we might just go to the next slide, Ben. Now, there's lots of numbers here. You don't need to read them all, but it just gives you a bit of an idea. They have licenses, obviously, of how much groundwater they can take, and the actual licenses that the 3 mines hold so far is about 24,000 million litres. That's 24 gigs of groundwater that they can legally extract. Now, in 2022, the combined 3 mines extracted 12,000 million litres of groundwater. That's a lot of groundwater. And also they intercepted in dams and so forth runoff another 10,500 million litres. So you're looking at a huge amount of valuable water, which every year is coming out of this landscape. And the problem with in the long term is that, once we get to a drought situation, this groundwater is what feeds the river, which keeps the rivers flowing, the groundwater dependent ecosystems, the large riparian areas that abut the rivers. And now, of course, they can't handle all this water, and so they've got to do something with it. And over the years, they have been discharging it down the river. They have now, with the more polluted part of the water that actually contacts the coal, which can get quite salty and with lots of impurities. They do put that through a reverse osmosis plant, and that's partly due to pressure over the years that we've forced the mines to do. They used to just sort of let it go, but that is then still they've still got a brine and so forth that they've got to manage. And the amount of water that they're releasing down the river is, as in 2022, it was, a substantial discharge. So within that discharge, they're also discharging salt. So it was the equivalent to over 13,500 tonnes of salt went down into the Hunter system with this discharge water. So even though they do treat the water, it's still carrying a lot of salt, and it's still not, obviously you don't want to dewater, lose all that water from that landscape. And when they stop mining, it'll take hundreds of years, they say, tens of decades, maybe hundreds of years before these groundwater systems can possibly recharge, and they will never be the same again. So, we've got to put a stop to the amount of impact that it's having on this landscape. And if we just go to the next slide, Ben, I think this is just an example of one of the highly valued environmental and cultural assets that we have that sits right between the Ulan and Moolarben mines on the Goulburn River. This is the Drip Gorge, and it's a recreational area. The parks now manage it. That was a bit of a fight to get it even protected. The mine Moolarben still has a exploration license to the north, so potentially they could put tunnels under the river and continue underground mining on both sides of the river, which would be disastrous for the river. And unfortunately, they do already have impacts. Like the approval is already going to impact to the river. We might just go to the next slide, Ben, which sort of focuses in a little bit on on the longwalls. Now, I hope this is not too confusing for people, but the blue at the top where it says the Drip Gorge is the Goulburn River, and the Drip Gorge is obviously right on that river. And you can see the longwalls from an approved mine below there. That's the Moolarben underground fall. They come very close, within 200 metres of the river, the existing approval. They've started mining. One of our current fights here, or at least pressure that we're trying to apply is maybe to get them accept the fact that they shouldn't go that close to the river. It is an approved mine, so that's going to be quite hard. But we're hopeful that sense will prevail, and they'll see that actually mining and dewatering that close to the river will be a very unwise movement. So that's about the main points I was going to say. The next slide is the Wilpinjong mine, I think. Sorry, this is an example of some of the salt that goes down the river 10 k's further down from the mine. So you can't continue to export water if you're going to have that much impact downstream on the downstream. This goes into national park as well. So I might move over to Bev. Kate, if any more questions, I'm happy to answer, but this is the Wollar, Wilpinjong, and Bev's got a bit more to say about policies and so forth too, I'm sure.
Thanks so much, Julia. That was incredibly interesting, and again, incredibly concerning in terms of the scale of that expansion. Lots of questions I'm sure will come flowing for that too. Bev, I'm going to go straight to you for your presentation. Did you want those slides up, or are you good to? No,
I'm right for the moment, but I'll if I think I need them, I'll let you know. So,
okay, over to you, Bev. Thanks.
No, thanks very much for the invitation, Kate, to share some information with everyone tonight. So I'm also meeting you from Wiradjuri country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I thought, being NAIDOC week, I'd like to start with a little bit of history of the first wave of colonisation in the Wollar area, where I've lived for most of my life. So the Wiradjuri man, Jimmy Governor, who was immortalised as Jimmy Blacksmith by Thomas Keneally, went to school in Wollar and played in the local cricket team. But he was badly treated as a farm labourer with a white wife, and there were horrific massacres occurring around the country. Though several of his revenge murders took place in this district, with Australia's largest manhunt conducted from Wollar Hall, and the local Wiradjuri clan were rounded up and shipped out onto a reserve in Brewarrina. So fast forwarding a century later, for the second wave of colonisation, coal mining. Again, the local community has been emptied out of the landscape, though not in quite the same violent manner, but the results have been similar. From Newlands to Bylong, there are very few local landholders left. Most of the properties are owned by multinational coal companies. Peabody Energy, the largest private thermal coal producer in the world, has bought out most of the Wollar village and surrounds, including the shop and 2 churches. And the school was closed down. The local bushfire brigade merged into a very large regional area due to the loss of volunteers. So in February 2022, the previous New South Wales government, under John Barilaro as mining minister, granted the new large coal exploration licence to the east of Wollar that was on that map that Julia had. So this happened after a very prolonged community campaign against the expansion of the mine that was granted in 2017 to produce 16 million tonnes of coal per annum until 2033. Now, this mine was first approved in 2006 to supply 7 million tonnes of coal a year to Bayswater Power Station in the Upper Hunter. Therefore, all the emissions from this coal are attributable to New South Wales greenhouse gas account. And the mine should have been winding down by now under that first approval, which was up to 2026. And people in the area have been virtually forced to sell out to the mine because of the noise, dust, odour, train movements and other impacts that have been too great to withstand. Most of these impacts are not recognised in the EIS studies or through the conditions of approval. It has been attrition by stealth at great mental health cost, with marriage breakdowns and economic disadvantage. None of the state's policies governing mining operations take into account the impact of these large-scale industrial operations on the very remote rural communities where there is no background noise, the air is generally fresh, water is precious, and wildlife and biodiversity abound. Now, those of us left on the periphery of the district are determined to continue on the fight and show that Wollar community still exists and has a future without mining. So Peabody has been rapidly drilling the new exploration licence area to find out what viable coal resources there. And the company is currently deciding whether to apply for a small area to start with as a modification of the existing approval, or whether to go for a larger area that would require a new state significant development application. The community is now waiting with bated breath to know which way this will go. So a modification tends to move through the planning system quickly and is approved by the minister. A new project has a much more rigorous assessment process and is approved by an independent planning commission. But both of these options cancel out the community right to appeal the quality of the assessment reports through a merits appeal in the New South Wales Land and Environment Court. These reports are produced by consultants paid for by the mining company with pressure to show that there will be little or no impact from the project. The government and the Independent Planning Commission rarely checks these reports, and it's up to the community to fund their own experts who are then generally ignored. Now, the Woollahra community appealed the very poor Independent Planning Commission decision in 2017 that adopted all the Department of Planning proposed conditions. However, we could only appeal on the process of the decision and not on its merit. Though we really need to have merit appeal rights through the Land and Environment Court reinstated for all mining projects. The cumulative impact in the district of the 3 large coal mines on the environment and community has been extensive. And the impact of the combined approved production of 58 million tonnes of coal a year on the climate crisis is critical. Yet all 3 mines have expansion proposals to continue production well beyond 2040. Now, we plan to take the fight right up to the new ALP government, who appear to be welded onto the spurious job and economic arguments of the coal industry, rather than considering the enormous cost of climate change to all of society and the ecosystems we depend on for survival. So those of us in the Mudgee area, we're working up on a campaign and thankfully supported by Lock the Gate, Mudgee Coal Alert, which will be a social media campaign, and we're hoping to launch that before the end of the month, so watch this space. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bev. So thank you, the 3 of you. There was a lot of information and you've got so much expertise to share with everybody on this. I will note that the first question that has, well, the second question actually, but from Nunes, this all sounds very depressing. What can we do? What can the Greens do? We will get to that. So I'm not going to ask what we can do at this point. That is, there is going to be a bunch of stuff that we can share at the end. I just wanted to tease through some of the issues first, but don't worry, there's going to be, I think every organisation on here, as Bev just said, Mudgee Coal Alert is about to launch, everybody's sharing that. Nick will talk about what Lock the Gate are doing, and I'll talk to you about some kind of plans, emerging plans from us and the Greens as well. Firstly, I just wanted to jump and remember, throw your questions into the chat if you into the Q&A, sorry, if you have any questions. I just wanted to just press with you, Nick, today. I mean, this whole thing in terms of fugitive emissions is just unbelievable. We always think, I've always thought of, you know, it's the coal, it's what we burn in the power stations, and it's what is burned in power stations overseas largely. And I think everything else has kind of been, people don't kind of focus on that in terms of coal mining in New South Wales or Australia. But today there were reports that the International Energy Agency just released its report has a methane tracker, undertakes all this analysis, which is a great thing that they do. They have called Australia out for underreporting our country's annual greenhouse gas pollution by as much as 28 million tonnes, by failing to record more than 80% of emissions that leak during coal and gas production. There's also, it talks about methane. So you just said that the emissions are increasing according to the annual reports of what the coal companies are reporting. But the International Energy Agency has come out and said there's potentially 80%, they're failing to record more than 80% of emissions. So that's frightening. What's your take on that?
It is a bit frightening, and yes, it's a big problem, and there are so many aspects to it. But yeah, if you did read the Sydney Morning Herald today, as Kate said, you would have seen that story. And if you've been interested in that issue for a while, you might have seen a whole bunch of stories slowly building, you know, reinforcing IEFA's analysis that was in the paper today. You know, what we're learning from satellites, from more sophisticated ground and air measurement of methane. So I won't talk so much about oil and gas at this point. I've been looking more closely at coal more recently, but yeah, there's fugitive emissions problems from all three. And the other thing is that we know that the methane is so much more potent than carbon dioxide over a shorter time scale, that plenty of climate scientists are very worried about how, you know, the risk of those gases pushing the climate beyond a tipping point, where we then start to see the runaway impacts of climate change. So there are some really serious risks to just doing nothing about methane emissions, which is kind of why the global community at the last big climate meeting got together and said, look, we need a global pledge to try and do everything that we can to cut methane emissions. And of course, they're referring to the very substantial and growing methane emissions that we know about. Then what all of these, the International Energy Agency and scientists like Professor Peter Rayner, who was in the Herald article today, you know, the experts are saying, well, these are credible concerns that the IEA has, and we need to get serious about ground truthing the numbers that the coal companies are reporting. We need to measure it from the ground, from the air, from the satellites, and get a better handle on what's going on to generate some pressure on those coal companies to do something. The other thing that I'll say is a general observation of looking at lots of these expansion plans and at the management plans for the existing mines. Typically what we're seeing in New South Wales is that as the coal mines expand, most of them want to go deeper into the coal seams. And in terms of the geology, you tend to strike more methane the deeper into the earth that you go. So mining deeper seams is a big problem. You're going to release more methane, which is why mines like HVO are saying, oh, hey, we want to keep mining out until 2050, give us a 25-year expansion. By the way, we're going to increase our emissions, we think, 8 times what they are this year by the time we get to about 2045. Is that a problem? And traditionally, the government's gone, well, of course it's not a problem because coal mining is amazing. We will always need it. We need to expand it continuously. And climate change doesn't really exist as a problem. Or if it does, someone else will deal with it later. And does it really matter anyway? Because look at all the jobs and royalty income that we get from coal. So why don't we just forget about it and get on with expanding these mines? And now what we're seeing is we're a state that's at one of the most at-risk jurisdictions globally. It matters. If we fail to take action on methane, be it from coal mines, oil or gas production, it's a serious and growing problem.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Bev, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, like, you know, everyone in the hunt has been sort of mentioning the fugitive emissions from open cut mines for, you know, a good 20 years that I'm aware of. And one of the problems is that those really shoddy reports assessment reports in EIS, I've been talking about, you know, the greenhouse gas accounting has very rarely or has ignored the fugitive emissions in you know, past project applications, and I'm pretty sure they don't do a very real job of it in, you know, current things that have been hitting the table. And these, you know, absolutely not one single more open cut mine should be approved because of those fugitive emissions. So, you know, that really strengthens our argument. No, you know, it just can't possibly keep happening.
Yeah, that's right. Like, especially in terms of the government stated commitment of net zero by 2050, which all of us who are focused on climate know isn't good enough anyway. There is no way, even just with that, like that will blow their budget out, won't it, Nick? Like,
look, it will. That's right. There will, and when there's so much uncertainty about the scale of the problem and our, as each year goes by, we get a better understanding of the scale of the problem. To be giving a coal mine a right to expand and then continue mining into a gassy seam that they're saying already is going to be a big problem and cause lots of methane pollution. The problem is that how do you unpick that? You've given them a legal right, a property right under your own laws to mine all the way through to mid-century, and they're very difficult to abate, those emissions from the open cut sector. There are things that they can do. But look, the other thing I should just throw in quickly about the difficulties of measuring coal mine methane emissions is there's a bit of a distinction between underground and open cut mines. There tends to be greater reliability of the numbers in terms of the underground mines because there's a more concentrated point sources. They can measure those emissions coming out of mine ventilation shafts and the like. It's a bit more of a guesstimate when it comes to the open cuts, hence these problems that the international community is pointing out. So yeah, it's quite irresponsible to be approving these expansions with hopeless prospects for mitigation and knowing full well in advance that it's probably an underestimate of the true scale of the problem in the first place.
Yeah, I'll just stick to this just in this kind of theme because it for a bit. Another question came through earlier from Rosemary. Is there any enforcement of the reasonable and feasible actions to be taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Is this the EPA? Is it up to the community? Nick, I think probably one for you, is it?
Look, it's a great question. Their system's completely broken. It's as though the coal industry and their friends in government have designed it. It's kind of designed to look like a facade of action, like something's happening, but really it's unenforceable. The government to date hasn't been interested in enforcing it. And so those reasonable and feasible measures, one of the problems, Rosemary, is that you ask the government itself, well, what is a reasonable and feasible measure? And they admitted, the Department of Planning admitted in the Narrabri Underground assessment last year that, look, there's no guidance. There is no agreement within government about what a reasonable and feasible measure even is. So if you made it into the Land and Environment Court and tried to prosecute a mine for not implementing reasonable and feasible, the first thing they do is they point to their greenhouse management plan. That's the document that by law is meant to contain the measures that they will implement. But when you look at those documents, they're full of vague, unenforceable statements like, we'll think about renewable energy, we'll optimize the gradients of the ramps out of our mines so that we burn less diesel. We will, service our vehicles so that they're in good order and don't burn as much diesel. And we'll investigate ways to reduce our methane. So if you said to a court, well, are they investigating? They can say, well, sure, we Googled emissions reduction measures for methane in our open cut. Tick, that's an investigation. Well, are you thinking about renewable energy? Yeah, we went on the internet and we had a look at where we might source renewable energy and how much it might cost. We investigated it. So that's a tick as well. So they've met their legal conditions of consent without actually doing anything. And as we saw from those top 10 most polluting mines, 8 of them are actually increasing those emissions. So to cut to the bit about the EPA, it's a very good suggestion. The EPA does have very broad powers. This current government, with Penny Sharp as minister, could decide to regulate methane as a pollutant as part of the environmental pollution license of those mines. And they could set targets and limits that would then be enforceable by the EPA. That power exists. The architecture to do that largely exists. What we haven't seen to date is the political will to do that. So absent that, we've got this hopeless system that's great for coal companies, terrible for the climate.
So, Kate, if I could just add, like reasonable and feasible are a perfect example of the weasel words that are in the conditions that are impossible to prove. whether they're being met or not. And a company can come out and say, well, it's not reasonable and feasible for us to do what you're proposing because it's going to cost us a bomb, and we'll close down and lay all these people off. So that's the threat that the industry uses on a regular basis. And Julia and I have seen the EPA fold on, where they've got the power to make strong, requirements, and the companies will just go to the Premier or somewhere and say, oh, well, if you're going to make us do this, we're going to lay off a whole heap of people. So the problem is back to the weasel words in the conditions of approval.
Yes, and when you can dump your methane pollution in the atmosphere for free versus paying for abatement measures to reduce those emissions, if you're a coal company, what are you going to choose? You're just going to dump it in the atmosphere for free, and no one's making you implement any mitigation.
Yeah, so it sounds like what is definitely needed. And as you said, Nick, there's been a kind of range of different articles and various things on methane coming out. I think there's been kind of a lot more coverage that I've noticed over the last kind of few months or whatever. And there's a kind of massive kind of awareness raising campaign on those issues, fugitive emissions, methane, which we can hopefully assist with, that's for sure. I wanted to jump to Julia in terms of water. So it's an interesting dynamic at the moment in New South Wales Parliament, because we've got a new Labor government. I think we've got ministers who are still kind of working out in some ways what they can and can't do. No, I think they're working out what they can do. Actually, I think that's just working out their entire portfolios from what I can see, but. So in relation to water and mining, like, it is just absolutely massive how much coal companies across the state and mining all around, not just coal, of course, takes. What I've heard from both this new Labor minister, but also with successive previous water ministers, is that anytime anybody raises with them the issue of water and mining, we're concerned about what this mine was going to do on this river, we're concerned about this groundwater, it's kind of flicked to either the natural resources or planning, and there's kind of this disconnect in terms of responsibility. Do you find that? Have you found that? And I'm interested to maybe Bev as well, who's also Inland Rivers Network, but what reform is needed so the water minister potentially has more concurrence and we start to, potentially we're able to rein in what's going on with water and maybe even stop some mines being approved because of how much water they're taking.
Look, yes, it's a really big problem, and there's a lot of connections or similarities with the methane regulation. They have a lot of exemptions. There's a lot of very broad conditions that it's open for interpretation, so it really does need to be tightened up. And as you alluded to, there's no one really that is in charge of water. Like, the EPA looks at the surface water, some of the pollutants. They don't want to look at groundwater. It gets shuffled off to New South Wales water, and it's been fragmented into many different parts, and so it's really hard to find and track down who it is actually responsible for mining water. And mines have all these exemptions. They actually, even though we do have reasonable regulations within New South Wales water, and it has improved over the last 10 years, it's still very much open to interpretation, and particularly with the mines, because they get exemptions. They don't actually have to do the same thing that a farmer might have to do in regard to the impacts on people. Like, for instance, the mines, if they happen to ruin an aquifer, so a landowner loses their water, well, they're obliged to replace their water. But how do you replace a river flow? This is one of the things that over the long term, once that water system is broken and destroyed, you can't put it back together again. And they really do have to take it seriously. They really do need to respect water systems and protect them adequately. And I suppose that comes down to a better policy and much more tighter regulations, and just not approving, being conscious of the fact that these mines are impacting on water systems, and that we can't just ignore that fact. With climate change, we're going to be reliant on those freshwater systems in the future, and we're, at the moment, we're just wasting them. Now, Bev, you probably have a bit more to add on that from the policy point of view.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Yeah, well, just one example is, the mines calculate how much water they think they're going to intercept, and then they have to go out in the market and get water licenses to cover that volume. But where they get the water licenses can be anywhere in the system, nowhere near the mine. And what's called unregulated water licenses for, as Julia said, for the farming community, there's rules in there where they have to stop pumping when the river drops to a certain level. But mines intercepting that water that's falling down into their holes, they can't stop pumping. So they've had exemption from that rule. And that purpose of that rule is to save a bit of water for the environment, which is the base flows that Julia's talking about. So mines are actually exempted from protecting the environment through water sharing plans. So there's a whole range of quite complex issues around water management and mines. And currently it's like, if they've gone out and found a license from somewhere, we tick the box and off we go. But I know with some projects like the Southeast Open Cut project at Ashton Mine, which we know the fabulous Wendy Bowman's held up for many years, that there were staff in the water agency that actually objected to that project going ahead. One of them lost their job and the other one got shifted to a totally different department. So, that we often see the case of people in agencies trying to do their job, but it's a matter of whether they get to keep their job or not. So
they're under-resourced as well. This is one of the big things. They have these regulations, but they don't have the people on the ground to go and check. They were reliant on the mines self-regulating on so many levels, particularly with water. And they get their own consultants. They pay in order to do audits and all this sort of thing, and it's all paid by the mine. So there is a conflict of interest, unfortunately, in those sort of situations, which is pretty obvious. But unfortunately, the government seems to think this is acceptable. There really needs to be a separate regulator from the point of view of the mines, so they don't employ their own consultants as well. And like the fact that they broke up the water departments and so forth is because they were starting to have an impact, as Bev was saying, but these people lost their jobs, etc., or they were shuffled off to one side, or in the end they just resigned because they weren't being listened to within government. So
I think at one stage, I think there was one officer for the entire New South Wales to actually look at the environmental impact statements, the water reports, and as we know, there's modifications going on all over the place. There's expansions, there's new mines. And I think one of the really positive wins we had with a mine that was really going to badly impact water, and that was the Bylong mine. So, the great effort that Lock the Gate and the community put in to stop that mine. So we've had the experience of stopping a greenfield open cut mine that was going to have, very, detrimental impact on the landscape and the water. So, we've done it before, and all together we can do it again.
Thanks, Bev. So what I might do, there's a couple of questions, I'll just combine them in the Q&A to you, and then, because I know people are very hungry in two ways, probably hungry for dinner, but hungry for a call to action and to know what we can do about things. So keen to get to that bit, but I want to make sure we don't let Natasha and Terry's questions just lapse. So Terry's, they're kind of similar in terms of what can we as consumers do. There's, boycott. How do we take our money elsewhere? Firstly, I would hope everybody on here doesn't have their energy or electricity coming from coal companies, but we could explore that. Plus just companies kind of reporting things anyway. How can we get them to report? What is this? How do you get companies to report things when they focus on covering up issues as money is all they're interested in? That is true. They're kind of companies, capitalism, big mega coal companies. From your campaigning experience, is there anything that works? Is there anything that we can tell people to do on this call about that? Nick, Bev or Julia, any ideas with that one? Obviously there's market forces campaigns, which is excellent. They do great work in pressuring shareholders. Anything for the individual?
Well, look, in terms of reporting, I mean, that's a political decision. All of the coal mines already are required by federal law to report in quite detailed emissions to the federal government. The problem is a lot of that data is not publicly available, and the New South Wales law is all over the shop. Some mines report a little bit of info, some report a lot, some don't report any at all. So we need political reform there at the federal and state level. And sorry, I got a bit confused if this question about
no, that's good. And Elaine has just kind of typed an answer into the question box, which is kind of good as well, in terms of just thinking about things. If you have a super fund that you are able to dictate where that goes, which everybody can, of course, look at making sure that that's ethical and not invested in coal. Yeah, there's lots you can actually do in terms of your electricity and whatever. So let's jump into actions and what we can do from here on in. So Nick, I'll throw to you first, because there's a few things I think that Lock the Gate are potentially thinking about. I know you've got something coming up that is not necessarily coal related, but it is all related in terms of fossil fuels, in terms of an action. Do you have any others?
Yes. Okay. So three things top of mind. Definitely, if you got a chance to send the do-gooder to that is in the chat box there to the Planning Minister and the State Minister for Climate Change, that'd be great, and just keep that issue alive that people are concerned about direct emissions from coal mines. Some of these mines eventually will go to a public hearing, so there'll be an opportunity for the community to pile on. We need to put some pressure on the government to change those pro-coal policy settings as well. So if you have a local member who's a crossbencher or a member of the Labor Party or the Greens, always good to chat to your local Green. I'd encourage you to have those conversations and keep raising this issue. In terms of, I think Kate was giving me a free pass there to spruik an event too that we have coming up in mid-September. It'll be Thursday, the 14th of September. We haven't quite got the date out there on the socials yet, but we will soon. And that'll be a kind of on a parliamentary sitting day on Macquarie Street, a big rally to demonstrate the broad community opposition to the Narrabri gas project going ahead, and calling on the state government to get serious about implementing the gas roadmap they promised pre-election, to start getting New South Wales off gas. So turn out in Sydney, mid-September on Macquarie Street, and put a bit of pressure on those coal mines and their emissions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. I just wanted to talk to people just about there really is a potential here for us to get policy change within the new Labor government. So that's of course, the Greens come out and say no new coal and gas. We've got to phase out coal and gas by 2030. That's our policy. That's what we're sticking to, and that's what we'll be campaigning on strongly to do. But if you look at the governments from the new Labor government's perspective, they're kind of looking at ways in which they can set their policy, hopefully, to be able to help, guide or otherwise whether these mines go ahead. And I'm saying this because it's very relevant potentially for our campaigns coming up. I think Bev mentioned, and maybe Nick as well, that the statement on coal that is current within for New South Wales was put in place by John Barilaro and was heavily politicised, was I think the Upper Hunter by-election, Bev, so heavily political. You would think that that would be an easy thing for the new Labor government to signal that they are willing to, they're taking climate change seriously, and they're going to do a new policy statement on the future of coal. Similarly with gas. Bev, there's a range of different reforms that I know a bunch of people are talking about to the planning system. You were mentioning merits appeal, for example. There's changes that need to happen with the EPA, and I know there's a fair bit of work going on for the likes of us and other crossbench members potentially, but then NGOs and advocates to push for once that work's done. So that's something. We have, from the Greens perspective, we are looking at also doing kind of politics in the pub style events on this kind of issue, if you like, in the coming months. So if you're from a local Greens group and you would like a politics in the pub or something similar in your local area, please get in touch, and I'll always see if I can rope in experts like Bev or Nick or whoever happens to be there to see whether they want to join in. That's that I think should start sooner rather than later. Nick's also talked to us about basically changing this state environmental planning policy, like a SEP, in terms of mining. We had some meetings the other day which were very encouraging with union representatives. I think it's worth, this was about Santos, but it's still very encouraging that we have unions that are looking at wanting to, stop a very, very big damaging project. That is quite significant actually for Unions New South Wales to do that. And I think the next step is to do what we can to see if we can influence the unions on the coal expansion issue. What is absolutely certain is that if you haven't written to your local member, if you haven't written to the ministers, various ministers on these issues, you should. Based on the information you have heard tonight, I notice that there's, looking in the chat, there's a heap of you that have tuned in from regional New South Wales, so it's really important that your MPs hear you. We'll be looking at organising like a day in Parliament at some point as well around this. The coal expansion in particular. There's one coming up in Parliament that's around kind of gas and electrification that Lock the Gate is doing. I want to do the same thing, co-host that with independents around coal expansion. So from our point of view, I think the job at this stage is to, firstly, we've got, it's like we have to inform and educate new ministers who are still really, really getting up to speed in their portfolio. So now is the time for us to launch campaigns, which I will be doing over the next few weeks, and for us to be getting this information about fugitive emissions and what have you before the ministers. So I'll be asking questions in Parliament about it. I think I got about 12 questions from Nick's presentation that I can ask the Natural Resources Minister and the Environment and Energy Minister when we get back. If any of you would like to help or contribute to this campaign, get in touch with my office. So this is kind of the first step in terms of bringing people together who are passionate about this issue. It's really, really important that we tell the story of exactly what is going on. People just do not realise that coal is actually expanding at such a significant rate in New South Wales. And this is a real test for Labor. As I said, the Greens have got a no new coal and gas, ending coal and gas by 2030 policy. But right now, Labor can send a very good signal to the New South Wales population, to people concerned about climate change, that they get it, and that they are serious about sticking to what is a paltry target anyway of net zero emissions by 2050. And our job, firstly as MPs and activists on this call, which we've all had talks about, is to get as much information as possible before the ministers and then give you actions to take. So we'll send out an email with links to various actions. We've got, if it's not put in the chat already, most of you have probably signed it, but we've got a petition that is to the planning minister and the environment minister, asking them, it's basically to keep coal and gas in the ground. We're going to do more on the whole fugitive emissions issue as well. And Bev has a hand up. The thing that we will also be doing is looking at ways to stop that long wall mining happening so close to the drip in Mudgee. I went out there and visited there just a few weeks ago with locals and saw that beautiful place. And longwall mining near there is going to do untold damage. As we know, longwall mining always causes subsidence. By its very nature, it causes subsidence. So Bev, I'm going to go to you. Nick, I'm going to go to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. Kate, I just wanted to make a comment. Earlier on in the chat, someone mentioned corruption. And I'm just thinking, you know, another place for the ALP is just a reminder is that the only people that have gone to jail for corrupt behaviour and coal mining has been past ALP ministers. So that's Eddie Obeid and Ian McDonald. And the ICAC, after all of that, ICAC put out some quite strong recommendations about the way to go forward with new coal releases, and the coalition's coal statement just backtracked totally on all of that, which is why we had the new exploration licence at Woollahra, that big one north of Ulan and another one up at Narrabri were all handed out, totally ignoring the ICAC recommendations, really. So I think we've got a bit of ammunition for the ALP to distance themselves from both their government's past behaviour, their past government's behaviour, and the coalition's behaviour, and they really need to show a difference by not approving these new exploration licences as additional projects. So, you know, I think we can tie the corruption story together with the ALP, and just another thing was Penny Sharp was Ian McDonald's parliamentary secretary at the time. So, you know, there's a lot of old history there that they actually need to demonstrate that they've moved on.
Thanks, Bev. Thanks for the reminder about Penny Sharp being Ian McDonald's parliamentary secretary. I had completely forgotten about that. Nick?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I just wanted to say very quickly, the other thing that I think is also worth mentioning at the end here is that, you know, I think all of us on this webinar tonight are concerned about those communities, the coal-reliant communities, and making sure that, you know, the landscape's restored, that we rehabilitate those mines properly as they close, and that there are real kind of economic opportunities in the diversification of those communities. The feds have created a new authority. Labor came into power saying that they would create regional authorities in all of the coal communities in New South Wales. There are these expert panels that exist in the Illawarra, the Western Coalfields, in the Hunter, out in the Northwest. You know, I reckon hit them up, ask them what they're doing, where are they spending that money, what ideas do they have? If you have an idea and you're in a regional community that mines coal, about how your community can diversify to be less reliant on coal as the coal mining winds down, and we need to make that transition faster. You know, I encourage you to reach out to those communities and chat to the government as well and get involved, because if we don't, it's going to be up that, you know, the same big businesses that have ridden roughshod over the community in the last couple of decades are going to have their way with the diversification of the future. So we need strong community voices. There's definitely an opportunity there, and the new government says it wants to be active in that space. So yeah, some good opportunities there, and there are some exciting things that are happening.
Thanks, Nick. And yes, I think it is also worth us thinking about ways in which we can pressure Labor as a party via unions. I think it is time for the unions to get a lot of pressure around supporting certain unions around supporting coal, and it's time for Labor, in terms of the Labor conference, for them to be, for the party, for branches, for members to be pressured. So we'll talk about that. Having said that, you know, we need to get Labor to be the one to change the decision. So we're also, because the Greens are in balance of power in the upper house, remember, which is an incredibly powerful place to be, we're also wanting to work with Labor to get good environmental reforms across, so that we're the ones supporting reform that they take to the Parliament, and it's not the coalition, of course. That's the position we're in. So this was the beginning of a conversation, and more than a conversation, of a campaign and action. It's going to be one of the major focuses of my office over the next, couple of weeks, months, years. So stay tuned. If you've tuned into this webinar tonight, you will hear from me because you're on my list and you follow what we do. So you'll hear from us about next steps in this campaign. Thank you so much, everybody, for putting into the chat how interesting you found tonight. Our panelists were just incredible. Thank you, the three of you, Nick, Julia and Bev, for everything you've done over so many decades in terms of campaigning for the environment and to protect nature and this beautiful planet of ours. It's because of people like you that we're actually able to get anything done at all, and that we can, in some ways, hopefully make a bit of a difference going forward. We have to. So let's do this. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks for your time. Thanks for giving up your Wednesday night, and you'll hear from us very soon about next steps in this campaign. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Watch out for magic coal alert.
Yes.
Look out. There you go.